I am so excited to be here today. I get to talk about Lensbaby. It's my favorite thing. Well, it's one of my favorite things. I got a lot of things that are favorite. And today we're talking about the journey of Lensbaby. We're talking about some of the hidden things, the things that went into the origination of Lensbaby. You know, I brought the original Lensbaby, the idea for the flexible hose. I'll get into that. Hopefully that's not a spoiler. And from there, it became a collaboration. It became a collaboration with you because that one innovation, I got feedback saying, hey, we want something new. And so, or something better, or something worse, or something different. And that was the biggest theme that was from the very beginning. People wanted something different than what they could do with their regular camera lenses, and Lensbaby gave it to you. And you're here, so you must have liked something about it, or you're curious about it, but welcome. I'm excited to talk to you about this, and so let's just dig right in. In 1998, I went to a workshop at Santa Fe Workshops, and it was a great workshop. I was documenting. I was a photojournalist, so I decided I was going to do this documentary project on this fly fishing school outside of Santa Fe, and I love fly fishing anyhow, so it was a good excuse to get out on a river. But one of the days, I rented or borrowed a tilt shift lens from the library there at Santa Fe Workshops. Amazing school, amazing project. I can't wait until they open back up for us to go down in real life. But one of the things they have there is a library, and they just let you use these tools. And I took this 45 millimeter tilt shift lens, put it on my film camera, we were all shooting film then, and went out into the river, put it on a tripod, shot it at 1 second. Now, I know I stacked the deck against me to be frustrated, but I was super frustrated with this lens because it only tilted a little bit. I mean, it tilted a normal amount for a regular tilt shift lens, but it didn't have a real strong effect, and I could not find where my slice was. It had numbers and dials and like scales. Like, I don't want to look at a scale when I'm out in the field photographing. So for me, I came away with a huge amount of frustration from that. And that was my first kind of seed of what ended up being Lensbaby. I mean, there's lots of frustrations that went into this, and solving those frustrations was a big key to that. But combine that experience with sharing a studio with about a dozen photographers, two of which were doing things that me as a photojournalist, I'd never even considered. One, Krista was shooting with a Diana camera, and I didn't know what that was. I didn't have an art background. I was a photojournalist, and I was going to make pictures that were corner to corner sharp, and I was going to try and be as invisible to the viewer as possible, where they looked at that and said, how did someone take this picture? I feel like I'm actually there. So that was my goal. And so I'm sharing the studio with a dozen photographers. Krista's shooting with a Diana camera, and Frank is shooting with a 55 millimeter macro lens, and he screwed on this video converter to the front. And okay, the images that both of them were making were unbelievable. Krista's in particular, in a show, like she printed a bunch of 16 by 20s and hung them on the wall of the studio, and I just walked up to these images where technically all of the things that I strived for as a photographer, she had not done none of them. I mean, the composition was great, but everything else, like, I didn't even know what this was. It was cross-processed, had no idea what that was, which was, I'm not even going to explain it. But it was crazy. The colors were all whacked, the focus was off, and for me, looking at those images, they inspired me to say, hey, what's going on here? What am I trying to convey? And am I missing out on something? Are my perfect lenses taking out some of the energy and the emotion that I can see in Krista's? And then in Frank's, he was shooting this fisheye converter on the front of his macro lens, And he was shooting portraits with it where he was getting, you know, an inch, 2 inches away from them, and they were crazy. They weren't the most flattering things, but they were more flattering than I would think for a fisheye lens. It was weird. It was crazy. But for me, that ended up planting a seed of saying, okay, what could I do? I was a working professional. I was shooting film. I wasn't really looking to experiment a whole lot, but a couple years later, when I broke everything that I stood for in terms of being a purist, and I had just, I think 2 days before, maybe a week before, at a wedding, somebody had come up to me with their little point and shoot digital camera, and this was in 2000, and said, "Are you going to go digital?" I'm like, "Nah, that doesn't really apply to me. I'm going to, you know, I'll shoot film for the rest of my career." A week later, I put a Canon D30 on hold or on order at Pro Photo Supply here in Portland. And that was totally counter to what I had been thinking, but you know, technology changed, and it wasn't just a wallet-sized photo that you could make with these as in terms of prints. It was a 5x7, and not too many of my clients ordered bigger than 5x7. So off I went into digital. I get this camera on a Thursday, I think, and on a Friday I flew to New York City. I went with one camera and one lens. I went with a 28mm f1.8 Canon lens. Loved that lens on my film cameras. I got to New York City. It was the most frustrating thing of my life that it was a 1.6 crop and I now had a 45mm. I couldn't photograph the way I saw because 28mm was a really important focal length for me, and it was the only lens I brought. So I pulled back on that experience and that respect for what Frank had done with his amazing portraits and that curiosity. And now when I took a picture, it wasn't $1 every picture. And I went into the camera stores around Times Square and found one of these similar lenses to him, to the one Frank had. He had one of a kind. I've never seen it. I've gone looking for it for years. And this is a 0.42x converter. I got a black one. I couldn't find it, so this is essentially the same thing. And I screwed it on the front of that 28mm lens. And it was just like, you know, it was $90. I was in New York. I wanted to shoot wide, and I couldn't. And Frank had done this thing. So he had planted this seed. I had wanted some special effects, but hadn't really taken risks in the past. I put this on my 28mm lens and stopped it down to f11, and I got pretty good shots. It was like a 16mm equivalent fisheye. It had lots of bending lines, and when I stopped it down to f11 or f16, maybe even f22, it was pretty sharp corner to corner. The center was always sharp. And so I said, well, I'll play with this for a little bit. You know what happened is I took this crazy lens, and at one point I tested it wide open, and I always do that. Maybe I learned it from this, that I tested it wide open even though I liked it stopped down, sort of. It was kind of a good lens, or kind of a not terrible lens. And I did test it wide open, and I said, well, that's pretty cool. The edges were out of focus. The lines, of course, were still bendy, and the center was sharp. So let me show you a few pictures here. So what I found with this was it allowed me to bring emotion and energy into my photos in the similar way to the way Krista had with that Diana camera. And that energy and that emotion wasn't necessarily present when I shot with a normal lens. And so it opened my eyes to say, hey, I can have a style that's not just about capturing the moment. It's not just about being a fly on the wall. It's not just about being invisible. And looking through a different lens gave me that. And two, I can photograph completely different subject matter or the same subject matter and get a completely different mood, get a mood that matches the scene. And so being able to take this image here at the bowling alley where I'm dragging the shutter, which would be something that I do in a situation like this with a normal lens as well. I'm doing some fill flash, and then you've got the craziness of the bent lines. You don't see much in terms of the edge, so this was probably stopped down to f8 or f11 or darker, I don't know. But at any rate, this gave me a different tool in my toolbox to give a presentation of what I had seen to my viewer that wasn't necessarily accessible. When I was a kid, I was curious. And in more ways than one. And one of the things I did was I'd take everything apart. I took my bike apart. I turned the handlebars upside down so that now I had to take the seat off for the front wheel and the back wheel to touch the ground. And doing that, I had to now sit on the handlebars and the back wheel would steer. So I was moving my body and sitting on the handlebars. I share this because there's some odd things about Lensbaby, and they come from somewhat of an odd place. And one of those things was that tinkering and that always curious, what's possible, and being able to turn my bike upside down, or half of it upside down, or 2/3, 80%, and have the handlebars right side up, but have to sit on the handlebars. That was a challenge for me. I wanted something that challenged me to say, oh, is this possible? And I fell. That first day, I probably fell 40 times. I ended up in the hospital because one of those falls, or multiple falls, had torn my esophagus internally. The doctor said they'd never seen anything like it. But I was really proud. Like I lived, but I was really proud of what I had learned. I'd learned a new skill that probably no one I knew had, and that was worth it. So, I don't know if my parents agreed, but I did all sorts of stuff like that, just hacking. And this is just kind of a minor hack. Like I just screwed this on the filter threads. It wasn't a big deal. I didn't have to take anything apart. But it was the beginning of my photo hacking. Over the course of the next couple years, I photographed far too much with this lens, and I tend to do that when I find something new. I tend to obsess about it, and that was my first obsession in photography that wasn't just a strictly normal lens or a normal camera or a different type of film or a different who knows what, but the things that were acceptable, the things you'd see in popular photography or Shutterbug, those are the things that I'd obsessed about up until that point. And over the course of the next 2 years, tons of photos. I took a workshop from Kevin Kubota. I was frustrated with my workflow. It's taken me 5 times as long to edit a wedding now that I was shooting half digital and half film, and I didn't know how to make those digital images look like real pictures. And so I took this workshop from Kevin Kubota, changed my life, but as the course of that, it was his very first digital boot camp. But in the course of that, he saw some of these images that I'd taken with this lens, and he called me up and said, for the third workshop, he said, Craig, I want you to come teach this stuff that you're doing with these crazy lenses. And I'm like, I'm thinking, I got one lens, New York City. I had gone out and I had tried to find a better one. Nothing. I'd found this ended up, or the black version of this that I screwed on my lens, ended up being the very best that I ever found. I probably bought 40 of them. So what am I going to teach? And so for me, I've always been a daydreaming. I've always been looking at, what can distract me and how can I get excited about that? And one day I'm in my studio, I'm supposed to be editing a wedding, and I'm looking around here, I'm looking around there, and I see my speed graphic camera sitting on a shelf. And I'd had an idea that I approached an engineer about, just to make stuff for me, not necessarily a product, but to be able to use my medium format lenses on the front of my Canon EOS cameras, and there just wasn't enough room. There was, maybe 1/8 of an inch, and that wasn't enough to tilt, and free lensing wasn't a thing, or I'm sure I would have gotten into it. And I looked and I saw my speed graphic camera, and it had a 101 millimeter lens, and it had all of this distance between the lens and the image plane, and I thought, well, that's more than 1/8 of an inch, and I need something to teach. What do I need to do to make that be something I can mount on my camera and make it work? And so I thought, well, I could use a bellows, but bellows are really flexible, and that's not, and I didn't have any bellows. I probably would have just used a bellows, but they're super flexible, so it's not going to really hold it up, and I'll be jittery and whatnot. So what I really need is I need something that I can squeeze against to focus, and it's just going to lock the light. You know, whether that's just pressing up against the mount, I didn't know. But I just wanted a resilient bellows. So I started searching for resilient bellows, and of course there's nothing about resilient bellows. That's my word. And a few days later, I drove past a local hardware store and am just walking through going resilient bellows, you know, and just no idea. And I come across a shop vac, and I'll tell you, nobody has been more excited in the history of shop vacs to come across a shop vac. Here's a shop vac, and I look at the hose and I'm like, that's it. It bends, it holds its shape, I can squeeze against it. You know, it ended up being quite stiff, and this is the shop vac hose that I bought that day. I cut off the end and then cut off a section. It ended up being the exact length that I needed to get close focus, and then when I squeeze it, I can get out toward infinity. And I took it to a wedding that weekend, maybe the next day, maybe a couple days later. And let me just show you an image here. This is one of the very first images from that very first morning up at Mount Hood Timberline. The groom is sitting on the ski lift with his groomsmen on the morning of the wedding, and I'm tilting that lens, and you can see that slice of focus going off toward infinity. Way more effect than I could get from that 45 millimeter lens, even if I figured it out. I did rent it a couple more times. It just continued to frustrate me, and this was what I was after, and I could not believe what I was seeing when I looked at the back of the camera. I look back at me as a kid and remember the curiosity that I approached life with. And it was not the same curiosity that the other kids approached life with. My friends would be playing basketball. I'd be staring at the rim, looking at the net, saying, you know, who thought of this way, this curlicue way to make the wires that would hold the net on? I was way more interested in that than getting good at my free throws or anything in basketball. And that curiosity has followed me, and that's what really led to the putting things together and the analysis of that rim as a kid, and 100,000 other things gave me the analytical kind of, I don't know, it's not really chops, but it is a background in just looking at things and saying, okay, how can that be different? How can these things go together? And how does that fit with this? So that curious kid on multiple levels it is a part of this project, and it's a fun exploration that kid gets to go through right here as I'm talking and learning and remembering these things. Well, the next step in the process was, okay, what else can I do? What other lenses? Similar to that 0.42x lens that I got in New York, and thinking, okay, there's got to be a better one. I started saying, well, there's got to be different lenses that do different things, and this is one of them. I went out, I got 120 folding cameras, I got this is a lens from a friend of my dad's who was an optical engineer at Tektronix. My dad was a mechanical engineer, and so Bob White would let me come over and he'd hand me lenses and say, can you use this, can you use that? And I would test the focal length just by holding it up to my SLR or holding it up to a piece of paper, and this was one of them. It's actually half of a CRT lens, and this one was very different because that speed graphic lens, when it was pointed straight ahead, it was just a 101 millimeter lens, normal, you know, I mean, if I could hold it straight. And this one had this beautiful painterly effect on everything. Like, it really didn't have much of a sweet spot. It was somewhat of a sweet spot, but let me just show you some pictures. So this is one of the images I shot. I shot this at the end of a wedding down on the Oregon coast, and you can see there's kind of a sweet spot over in the lower right, but that painterly treatment of the colors and the hues, and it was just unbelievable. And you know, made for some wonderful black and white images when I bumped the contrast up. It gave me a mood. It gave me a way of looking at a scene and feeling a mood in what I saw, and to be able to convey that to my viewers gave me something I'd never had before. And so here it was. I had this precision lens that I could tilt and get this slice of focus, and then the next thing I did was find this really non-precision thing that really wasn't that sharp. It was only half a lens. It was turned upside down, I think. I don't know. I don't know how it was intended to be made because I don't have the other half. But regardless, this was something exciting, and you can see here in this third image the playfulness, the sense of just emotion and connection that lens was able to create on the front of my DSLR was super exciting and super unique for me. I was able to give my clients images that were just so different than the other photographers had in the local community and you know, anywhere actually, the whole world. I had a unique lens nobody else had. I had something that could be done, and that's really the way, that ability to do something that nobody else can. I thought that's my edge. That's where I'm headed as a photographer. I'll always be able to stay ahead of what's going on and have that unique style. But you know, it wasn't much of my images that were coming from these particular lenses. It was maybe 5%. You know, this particular wedding, the clients were just so up for anything. I think, you know, maybe it was 7%. But regardless, I shot as a photojournalist most of the time, and then would come in and, you know, more of a National Geographic look to my images, or that was my hope. And then I would pull those lenses out when I'd gotten all of those safe images and I wanted to play. And those were the images, more often than not, that my clients really connected with. If I look back to childhood and think about a parallel to this exploration and finding these crazy half lenses that I can shoot with, I remember having a tire swing in my backyard, and I would spin it, you know, probably 1,000 times and get it, you know, to shorten up. You know, it was like a 20-foot rope up into this huge maple tree, and I would spin it and 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 spin it until I couldn't hold it from going back the other direction anymore. And the reason I did was I wanted to jump on that tire swing, and I wanted to spin as fast as I could and then go out and have it slow down. And I was so curious, like, how does that work? Why when I'm out and my legs are out and my head is out and my arms are holding onto the swing or the rope, does everything slow down? And why when I come in does everything go so fast? It's crazy. You know what was great about that experience and that obsession with how this worked or why it worked? It was fun. And that's what I found here. Even though there was this technical aspect of, okay, what's the focal length? Can we get it to focus? Can we find a piece of tubing that's the right length? And you know, drilling or machining a hole in a body cap that we can snap the tubing into. That's all like left brain stuff. But then I got to go out on the beach and play and explore what was possible, what this could create. And that's the spinning and the tire swing for me. I look back on that and I'm like, oh yeah, I was curious, but really I just had a fun experience. I got to spin and spin and spin and spin and spin and spin and spin. It was awesome. And that 20-30 foot rope, man, I could get a lot of turns in that. So the next step after I've got two of these things is to figure out, okay, what do I do with with these that can be interesting, that I can go back to Kevin Kubota. He asked me to teach at a workshop. I didn't have anything to teach. I came up with the Lensbaby with that speed graphic lens. Now I've got another lens. I've got 2 lenses. I still can't tell people, go do this or go make this in this certain way. So I didn't know what I had. So my goal was to get at least 10 for the 25 people, 10 of these prototypes that I could put together that people would be able to go out and experiment with and tell me, what do I like? What do I not like? And so it quickly went, because really the motivation for this project was largely because I had to have something to teach. So it wasn't so much about having a unique, one-of-a-kind lens all of a sudden. It was more about, okay, how can I teach? How can I help Kevin with this project? How can I spread the enthusiasm for photography, for creativity, for exploration? Had no idea if this was going to resonate, but off I went. So I went with a bunch of lenses. Some of them were really primitive, like Holga lenses that had been taken off by holgamods.com, and they put other lenses on there, or pinholes on, and so I took those and I brought them and put them on shop vac hose, and I had the really good lenses. I got 120 folding cameras that I took the lenses off, put them on a piece of shop vac hose, all sorts of stuff. And what I saw was people really resonated with the simple lenses. And so when I'd give them something like the speed graphic, a lot of these photographers already had experience with bellows cameras or view cameras and tilt shift lenses, or they own tilt shift lenses, and they would come back and say, well, I can do that with my tilt shift lens. What else do you got? And it got more and more and more simple, to where I actually went out and just got the cheapest. It was almost like a dare, like, okay, how do we dumb this down as far as we can? And I went out and got eye loops off of eBay from India for, $20 for a dozen of them, and they'd be all different focal lengths, but it was just a magnifying glass essentially, and a bad magnifying glass at that. But I'd put an f5.6 sized, what is this? It's a Aperture, but like a little piece of plastic that I'd glue in the back, and that would stop it down, and it would give a nice, decent sized sweet spot. And I sent that out with people, and oh my gosh, the people that didn't like the speed graphic lens, which of course you couldn't source those, and if you made it from scratch, we'd be talking, hundreds of dollars, maybe thousands. And to be able to give them a magnifying glass and have them come back and say, this is what I'm after. I can't do this with my regular camera lenses. This image here is from Red Square in Russia, and I was able to take this right after. It's actually the very lens I'm holding. I was able to take this image like the week after I built this, and this is when I decided, okay, this is what the lens is going to be. These are the specs for the Lensbaby that I'm coming out with. Because I had come back from one of those workshops with Kevin, and my soon-to-be business partner, Sam Pardue, who was doing marketing for my photography business, had asked me about Lensbaby. I brought it up. He'd say, well, what is it? I showed it to him. He didn't take that too seriously because, it didn't look like much. But he said, do you have anybody to call? So he called the photographers and that had been using the lens, got a hold of 7 or 8 of them. All of them had the same feedback. I can't do this with anything else I have. I feel like it's reignited my enthusiasm and my joy for photography. And that's all he had to hear. He said, I'm in. And he came in and he paid for the website, he paid for the patent, and I said, okay, I'm going to come out with a product that we can sell. And so this was that product in my mind. It had a water jet cut piece of plastic snapped on the front so that you could squeeze and focus it without getting your fingers in the front. It had these eye loops from India, and I'd get a dozen of them or 20 of them, I don't even know. And of those, only 20-30% of them were the right focal length. Maybe I would be lucky and get 50% out of one batch. And then they have scratches, so some of them I couldn't put into a lens that we could ever sell. And so, like, this was not a repeatable model. I had a friend of mine, Bob, who was cutting holes in the body caps, but I decided after this trip to Russia that we're going to sell this. This is going to be the end product. So we sold, I don't know, a couple dozen of them that fall. This is fall of 2003. And I got an email from one of our customers. It was all sold online. And he said, I took the lens out of the box when I got it. I looked at it. I didn't put it on my camera. I put it back in the box. I'm going to send it back to you. I want my money back. And I thought, well, of course you want your money back. You didn't take pictures with it. And so for me, having that experience of taking the pictures and knowing that that's really where this is, to be on Times or Red Square and to be able to make images that are something that nobody has ever made of Red Square before. That's the joy, and that's the enthusiasm that I had for it. But I realized we don't have a product. But before I do that, I want to talk about this randomness that I experienced. And I remember as a child, I would stare at the ceiling. We had these plaster ceilings in our house that had this totally random pattern. It was very porous, like it felt like sandpaper, because the walls were that way too. And it's really a curious finish. I've never seen that in any house before. But I would lay in bed in the shadows when the light would come from the side, and I would look for some sort of pattern. Like, what is this that I'm seeing? What is it? What does it mean? I'd see faces in there, and I think going from total randomness of, you know, anything's possible, and bringing that into a place of let's put some order to this. Let's look for some repeating patterns. Let's look for the eyeballs or the fangs of the monster that I would look at, and that kind of wanting to make sense of things. You know, it might be a stretch, but I think this and the images that it created came from that little kid, that little Craig Strong, that was looking at things that didn't make sense and saying, I want to make sense of this. From there, we went to, we had probably about 6 weeks at that point to get from a lens that somebody is not even willing to put on their camera to a lens that we're going to introduce at a trade show in Las Vegas in 6 weeks. And it took me about a week of dead ends of going to machine shops. I had no idea what I was doing. I was a photographer. I was not a manufacturer. I was not a designer. I didn't even know how to have a conversation about design. I just would go and go to Home Depot and get some shop vac hose, and I'd go down to the plastic shop. That's the closest I could get to talking with a supplier and say, I need something that's, you know, this round by this round, and they'd have to do the measurements for me. And so I had no idea what I was doing, and it was tons of learning. And one of the things I learned was there are people out there ready to help. And what I got eventually, I got to 2 suppliers. The first supplier was in Oregon City, and it was ProTurn, a precision machine shop. And I came in, I think all I wanted was a front lens cap. And I thought, oh, it'd be cool to make that in metal. That would make somebody actually put it on their camera. I don't know why I was thinking that. But the approaching Steve, who was the owner of a machine shop that wasn't very busy at that moment, and he was motivated. He wanted a new client, and so he actually took my idea and he said, "Well, okay, yeah, I can figure out a lens cap, but what if it screwed on to something that was metal?" that I also made. I'm like, oh, that'd be cool. And all of a sudden my thinking started to get a little bit bigger, and then I said, well, can you machine hundreds of body caps so that they've got a hole in them that I can snap the tubing into? And he said, yeah, but I could make that out of metal too. And I'm like, my mind is blown at this point, because I'm like, wow, that's a real lens. And Steve actually took this project, and in 5 weeks from the time I sat down with him, he had designed, anodized, laser marked, and had delivered to me in time for the show all of the parts for our first order. And the enthusiasm that I had for this project went through the roof at this point. And I knew that once I had those machined parts, even before they were anodized, when he sent me test parts, that this is going to be something special. And because it was a real lens, people would put it on their $4,000, $8,000 DSLR. They were expensive back then. And it wouldn't be a misnomer to say, oh, this is something you got out of a Cracker Jacks box. It was a big Cracker Jacks box, but I don't want to put that on my camera. And that's basically where that prototype that we sold a couple dozen of on the website was. And from there, the other supplier I found came out of a problem I had. We had an f5.6 aperture, largely because I wanted to drop the aperture into the metal cup, or it was a plastic cup with the original Lensbaby, and then put the glass on top of it, and then put a retaining ring so that if it falls apart, it falls out. Nothing ever goes into a camera if a Lensbaby falls apart. And so, because we didn't want to ruin people's cameras, if the lens gets broken or falls apart, then we just replace it, no big deal. So that was my reasoning, but that also meant it did not have interchangeable apertures. During this time, I was not sleeping very much. It was, my mind was just constantly going, because like I said, I was a photographer. I had no idea what I was doing in terms of making a product, but that's what I was doing. Sam and I were on this journey together, and my job was to make a product that he could sell. And in the middle of the night, 3:30 in the morning, I wake up and I'm like, what if we stop it down from the front? And I went online, I'm like, looking for old lenses and seeing where the apertures were. I didn't find anything. I had no idea whether this would work or not, but it's 3:30 in the morning, it's dark. So I had to wait until the morning, and this is an image here of my daughter once the sun came up, or it was Portland, so the sun made things brighter, and she came out and she was my test subject. And sure enough, not only did the f5.6 aperture that I was going to put from behind, that I taped in on the front, not only did it work, but it looked a little bit better, and it was a little sharper image, and the sweet spot had a little better fall off to the rest of the image. And so I took that image, and then I took the aperture out altogether and just put a little tape around the edge of the lens, and it was an f2.5 lens at that point, and I took this image of my son Will, and I said, oh, this is it. Because now we have a variable effect. We're not just stuck dark. None of our cameras at that point had variable, or had a EVF or the ability to see your image digitally. So you were looking through an f5.6 lens and trying to squeeze to focus, which was already a pain, and it just wasn't going to work. So, it was going to work, and all my beta testers loved it, but this was one more option, and I'm all about options, and this was something at 3:30 in the morning came upon me. By the next morning, I was like, yes, we're doing this. And I now am 11 days away from WPPI, and we had to figure out, okay, what's going to happen between now and then that I can actually figure out how to do this. The key to that was we already had the apertures being made, the metal apertures being made here in Portland, and I was able to just go to him and say, okay, we want a whole bunch more because we had f2.8 to f8, but we want them made out of plastic. And that same manufacturer just shifted and made them out of plastic, and we were able to do that. But then how do you keep them in? And so I had to brainstorm this, ended up with a square, big fat square O-ring, and the apertures would fall out when, sometimes on accident. But the O-ring, once you put it in properly, it was nice and secure, and so that was our solution. So 11 days later, we end up at the trade show, and off we go. The beauty of this entire situation, or the journey for me, was that we went from an idea that Sam said and the people that he interviewed said, this is something I want, to something that when we got to that trade show, it was crazy. We got mobbed. By the third day, we sold out the first 2 days. By the third, I was building them in our room at night, and by the third day, we sold out in probably a half an hour. There was a line at the booth before we even got to it, and I just went up for the rest of the day and was building lenses, and all of our beta testers from Kevin's workshops that were at the trade show, they were running them back and forth. They were coming up to the room and getting my built lenses and bringing them down to people who'd already paid for them and were waiting there at the booth. So it was a really exciting time, and yet another one of those moments that I'm like, oh, hey, this is actually going to be something great. And this is an image that we took on the trade show floor of Sam and B. Dyer and myself. Peggy Dyer was one of the early beta testers, and she brought her mom along. She didn't have anything to do. She spent the entire time in our booth, and we loved her. Couldn't have done it without her. So many stories like that came from these early days of Lensbaby. So we've got a lens now that has an internal aperture. I mean, not really, but it's inside the lens, but it's interchangeable. And as hard as it was to get in and get out, it did broaden the perspective of what people could do with that lens. And that all came out of the criticism that I received from that customer who said, your lens is not worth $70, and if it is, I don't want to use it anyhow. And he hadn't even put it on his camera. So this little crackerjack thing was worthy of criticism. And so that self-criticism that I was so defended against, or from other people getting that criticism, was largely because I was so self-critical myself and so introspective. But I look at all of those experiences as building to this experience, where I was able to get feedback from somebody that was not positive, and yet be able to incorporate that in a way that actually served as a wonderful foundation for where Lensbaby went next. And from there, over the course of the next year, we actually, within 2 weeks of that trade show, sold out of all of our inventory, and we expected that our inventory would last a year. And Sam went full-time. I had 2 years worth of weddings still booked. So it was a pretty crazy time business-wise for a photographer who's now playing an engineer on TV. I hadn't even gotten to that point, but I was in a role that I was totally unfamiliar with. And eventually that went into the Lensbaby 2.0, same form factor, but it had magnetic apertures and a sharper, brighter lens. And then we took that sharper, brighter lens and aperture system into the 3G. This is a prototype. It's one of the early ones. We have an engineer who loves to see clear parts, so he can see exactly what's going on. So I'm glad that Bill loved that, and that we ended up with a mostly clear prototype here. But that was a whole other thing. Like there was so much going on. But let me show you some images with the new aperture system and from the 2.0 and the 3G, which were the same, to be able to capture these portraits of my my kids. This is probably at f2.8 or f4 on the 2.0. And then just be able to capture something really, really unique. And my kids, if you look back over the course of all of the photos of them, you'll say, oh, Craig was shooting or developing this lens and then this lens. And, sorry kids about the fisheye period as far as flattering photos. But to be able to get these images of my kids and give a completely different effect is really, really what I was looking for, and to get that, to be able to get that emotion from the images that of my kids' childhood that I would have missed with a sterile, straight lens. It's just, it's cool. I like looking back on that. I hope someday they will as well. So the 3G, if I look at this, I'm reminded of when I was a kid. I lived in the woods, and I would make live traps to see if I could outsmart the animals in the woods. And didn't hurt any of the animals, but it was this kind of like, how do I put this together with that in such a way that I can change and outsmart, or there were all of these things that for me they didn't matter to anybody else, but they mattered to me, and they gave me that opportunity to say, okay, this is what I care about, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm going to do. But this, I tell you about the traps because there is a real sense of that, we're moving, we're looking at mechanical options to be able to take this and lock it in place and then unlock it. It was really drawing on that problem solving that I had when I was a kid. From there, we went to the Optic swap system. And the Optic swap system was the Composer. This is the Composer Pro 2, but the Composer, and it had interchangeable optics to where instead of just having a single lens that was different, like we were selling before, different than any other lens on the market, we were now selling something that not only was it a different effect and a different type of focus, especially on the Muse, which was flexible bodied like the previous 3 versions, but it also gave you the ability to swap out your optics. So this came out in 2008, at the end of 2008, October, I believe, and it really broadened the number of options that we could give people, because you can see here I was even able to make a pinhole in a zone plate lens that we were able to put in to give people a completely different effect. And that's really what Lensbaby is all about, is moving into a space where you can get anything that you want that's possible out of our system. With the Optic swap system, we have the edge optics, and when those are pointed straight ahead, they are extremely sharp corner to corner, and then when you tilt them, you get your effect. So that gives you a lot of variety here, and really this is the lens that I was after when I was at Santa Fe, was something that I could just tilt in one direction and had a long focus range, got me a really thin slice if that's what I wanted, because it tilts twice as much as a normal tilt shift lens. And this opened up this Optic swap system with different optics, where we can get something super organic and artsy like the pinhole and zone plate, which switches back and forth between pinhole and zone plate options, or the other 5 optics that we had at the time. We've come out with 15 since, and this reminds me of me as a kid taking everything apart. I mean, to a fault. I would take everything apart, and once in a while they'd go back together, giving our users the ability to do that without breaking it, because I broke most things as a kid, is really close to my heart. So I think this came out of who I was as a kid and as a person. And you can see that all those options and that ability to modify what you've got gives you more options, and that's what I'm all about, and it drives my business partners and our team crazy, because I'm always like, no, we got to add this, and we got to add that, and we got to add that. And these days I listen to them when they say, nah, that's not going to work, or that's too expensive, because I've got a little more business sense than I used to. But the journey that I've gone on has been really influenced by that little Craig who was seeing something and saying, how does that work? From there, we went to the Velvet system, and the Velvet lenses are macro focusing. They're a real lens, because in 2008, when we came out with this, we took an already odd system, and as far as the actual lenses, the creative effects lenses, and we made it more complex. And a lot of people looked at that and they just kind of glazed over, and they're like, oh wow, you can swap the optic? I have no idea what that even means. And then they walked away, and maybe you did that, but you came back. A lot of people came back to Lensbaby after a lot of exposures and their crazy friend off, shooting these amazing images with it. They came back when we started making the standalone lenses. This is our first standalone lens, was the Velvet 56. Did not have any kind of optic swap system. It worked like a regular manual focus lens, and this was a bit of a miracle, because when we came out with this, we really needed to come out with a product that people wanted, and our timeline was very short. Our suppliers really rose to the challenge, and our optical engineer made a lens unlike any other lens, because usually these are the lenses with glow or soft focus, and soft focus lenses tend to have very little detail when they've got a lot of glow in the image, and certainly not outside of the center. And with this lens, there's a very sharp underlying detail even at the brightest apertures. And let me show you a couple images here. I was able to take these out and shoot neowise with the Velvet series, and this was the first night I went out, and I had all my Nikkor lenses with me and expected that that's what I'd be using. But the moment I saw this, I said, nope, I'm not using any of those lenses. I'm just using Velvet. So I shot for 3 nights toward the peak of the neowise show that we had, and this was the first night that I shot, and it was with Velvet 56. And then the next night I came, met some really great friends this night up on the mountain, and this is with the Velvet 85, and you can see the Velvet 85 when you're, especially at the brighter apertures. This is, I think, f2.8. It has a bit of a sweet spot, and the corners go a little bit blurry, with focus that's not great, and that underlying detail is mainly in the center. But the emotion and the mood to this image is something that really it sings for me. And again, I was like, nope, this is all I'm shooting stars with from now on. And then the third night, I went out and photographed with the Velvet 28, and getting this. With this particular lens, this is wide open at f2.2 essentially, because we have a plus sign, because we didn't think anyone would want anything that glowy. We wanted people to know this is over the top, but it wasn't over the top for me in this situation, to where the detail underneath that glow, even though you see those big halos around the bright stars, that the detail underneath the glow and even off in the corners is really sharp. So this really is my favorite Velvet, and these lenses are, for me, an example from my childhood of having an engineer for a father who had a woodworking shop. He would would fix my toys with aluminum parts that he would do on the mill at work, and they were amazing. I remember being totally enthralled with this aluminum piece that he had fixed one of my things with, and like I didn't even care about the thing that much other than the fact that it worked now, but here's this beautiful aluminum hook that he put on there that fit my finger perfectly. It was way better than the plastic one that had been on it from the manufacturer, and it was exciting. And so for me, having appreciated that fine craftsmanship prepared me to say, okay, we can give people a product, and this has been our goal ever since, a product that you hold in your hand that says, hey, this is a work of art. And so that experience from my childhood really affected that. And from there, we're pretty much just talking about exploration. Like Lensbaby, I love my job in that I get to play with the craziest stuff. Like I went in looking for what we're going to do here, and I don't know why we have this, but it seemed like a good idea at the time, I'm sure, and maybe I can cut strips of this and put it into Omni, or I don't know what, maybe it'll be its own product, but it's pretty cool. I get to do that, and I don't know what you see, but I don't know, tell me, do you want it? And then we've got I feel like my job is one of the best jobs on the planet, to where I get to just say, okay, what do I do here? What's the, and Omni gives us a huge outlet for that. And I don't know what's next. This is doing that, and these are doing this, and I get to do that, and I don't know what that is, but like this is it. Like if I can step away and feed that daydreaming Craig from grade school or from before, like and if that can do the work that's needed to find the products that you're going to connect with, that's going to help you express your vision of the world, that's all I need, and that's what I want to do. And I am in such a great spot because I was able to kick this off as a creative working on a project for me. But then I got all of you to be part of this, because this is a collaboration. Me and my team at Lensbaby are exploring ideas, and then you're coming to us with feedback, you're coming to us with passions or with questions of how do I photograph something that I see that none of my other lenses can quite get right. And fortunately now Lensbaby we have Sweet Spot, we have Twist, we have Velvet, we have, what else do we have? We have Edge. And to be able to have these various effects, to be able to pick up, put on your camera, say, hey, this works for me, or no, this doesn't work over here, but it works over here. And we've done the purchasing of the 40 lenses that took us to get here, so that you don't have to. If we're to go back in terms of like that kid that turned his bike upside down, or most of his bike upside down, and rode it backwards while steering with his butt, that I ride a recumbent now. Like, I don't really care what people think, and I get a kick when I get comments about that, because I look like an idiot. I mean, not really, I'm not an idiot, but I look like an idiot, actually, out there on my recumbent, and because I commute in town. Like, it's a country, it's a touring thing, but for me, that harkens back to, hey, I want to learn something new. I want to be different in a way that serves me. Like that riding on my handlebars way back when I was in high school. that was our grade school. That was something for me that gave me great satisfaction. And I think there's a lot of things in my work that harken back to, hey, I get to experiment with new things. I get to learn to ride a bike in a different way. I get to be more comfortable on my recumbent, and I don't care what people think. You must not care what people think either, to some extent, because your images are going to be different. If you're shooting with Lensbaby, your images are not going to be the norm. And so if you can say, I'm looking for my particular vision of the world, and it may involve this crazy creative stuff, more power to you. We love you, and I love the fact that you're a part of this community, and looking at how to be more part of that. And I think that ultimately the community is where the meaning is, and it's not going to be perfect. I learned about a worldview, wabi-sabi, Japanese concept, and it's appreciating the beauty in impermanence, incompleteness, and imperfection. And Lensbaby is going to be imperfect. It's going to be incomplete. We're always going to be building. You saw how that first Lensbaby, because of your feedback, changed into the second and into the third, and now into an entire lineup. But it's always going to be evolving, and what we have now is going to build on what's next. And I promise you, what's next isn't going to be the perfection and the sterility of what you can get from every other lens manufacturer. It's going to be something that has heart and soul, and is going to be different and allow you to express your vision of the world in a way that you just can't otherwise. And I'm excited about that, and I'm excited about you being a part of this. This is going to be a great week. Thank you for listening to me this long. I know I go on and I get excited about things that not everybody's excited about, but I've lived this journey, and it started very young, and you have lived your journey, and you're part of this community too, and you're able to, and this community is able to influence where Lensbaby goes next. And I'm super excited about having you here and seeing where we go as a community. Thank you. Have a great conference.